Well, good evening, everybody. Good evening, and a very warm welcome to this evening's joint event. I believe the first joint event between the Edinburgh Sir Walter Scott Club and the Muriel Sparks Society. So it's a real delight to be coming together this evening. You may well think, well, for those who like that sort of thing, that is the sort of thing they like. But I would put to you that the opportunity to bring together two writers such as Scott and Spark that you wouldn't perhaps usually think of, it gives us an opportunity to re-examine their literary contexts and lots of hopefully very exciting and interesting ways to view those authors. So I'd say, what is there not to like about this sort of thing? So before I get on to introducing our speaker for this evening, just a wee reminder that of course we'll have our lecture or talk, and then there'll be time put aside towards the end for some questions as well, and then of course like refreshments at the end. So I do hope that if you're able to stay for those, that you will do so. So without any further ado, it's my very great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, Professor Gerry Carruthers. Professor Carruthers is Francis Hutcheson Chair of Scottish Literature at the University of Glasgow and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. He is known for his work across Scottish literary studies, but perhaps is best well known for his prodigious output on Robert Burns, from his work as General Editor of the Oxford University Press Collected Works of Robert Burns, to establishing the Centre for Robert Burns Studies in Glasgow in 2007, which was recently, last year I believe, awarded the very prestigious Queen's Anniversary Prize. He's currently working on a new Burns biography, as well as a major new monograph, Robert Burns, Patronage, Fraternity and the People. And then beyond Burns, when we look at Scott and Spark, he's our past president in 2015 and formerly a research fellow at the Centre for Walter Scott Studies at the University of Aberdeen, and co-editor of Scott's, and I'll try and get this right, Reliquiae Trochcosiensis. And he's been involved in a number of boards and editions and projects to do with Scott as well. And as if that wasn't enough, he's also written a number of articles on Muriel Spark and her works, and very recently has co-edited the Crooked Dividend New Essays on Muriel Spark in 2023. And so it's a delight to have you here, Gerry. Very much looking forward to this talk, and thank you very much for being here. Over to you.
Thank you very much. The Edinburgh Sir Walter Scott Club and the Muriel Sparks Society. What a great audience for a Glaswegian. Also, what a stupid idea for a talk. Muriel Spark and Walter Scott and the Borders and Edinburgh. I'm going to have to find some economical ways of working through a number of routes here and hopefully making some kind of sense of that as a topic. Sunglasses aren't going to help, are they? Breathed are the man with soul so dead, who never to himself hath said, this is my own, my native land. Some obvious lines from Scott. And then a short passage that I want to read from the Prime Minister Brodie, to which I'm going to return. And many times throughout her life, Sandy knew with a shock, when speaking to people whose childhood had been in Edinburgh, that there were other people's Edinburghs, quite different from hers, and with which she held only the names of districts and streets and monuments in common. Walter Scott and Muriel Spark both do quite a lot to advertise to the wider world ideas of Edinburgh and also of the Scottish Borders. They're two writers who, throughout their work, feature a strong sense of place. But at the same time, I want to suggest to you, that place is often less certain than we might think. So they've been very successful advertising Edinburgh, the Borders, but these places in their writings are often a bit more treacherous. They're also two writers who do not necessarily fit easily into ideas of Scottish culture, of Scottish literature, a bit paradoxically. In different ways, they are both a wee bit awkward. For a start, if we think about politics, both of them are essentially unionists, oh dear, and therefore both occasionally are seen not to fit. But I rather like that about writers. I would prefer my writers not to fit easily with the programme of the Scottish Government or Creative Scotland. I would like my writers to be writers who ask problematic questions. And although in some ways Scott and Spark are seen as rather conservative in their ideas of Scotland, and I'm not sure that's exactly true, they both nonetheless ask challenging questions. So they're very visible in their bordersness, in their Edinburghness, and all kinds of obvious ways that I probably don't really need to go into, but I'll maybe come back to some of those. We might think about Scott in terms of Edinburgh, obviously enough, the Chronicles of the Canongate, to which I'm going to return. Very interesting book in that it features a ne'er-do-well, sometimes so described, narrator, Crystal Croft-Angry. It refers to a bit of the Royal Mile that has a bit of history, which is a bit of a palimpsest. We've got the early 19th century, where Crystal Croft-Angry is a man who has run into financial troubles, a bit like Scott himself at exactly that period. And we get given three stories, three chronicles of the Canongate in the first volume, none of which have got a lot, in fact, to do with Edinburgh. The Two Drovers, which ranges from Scotland, from the Highlands down to England. We've got the Surgeon's Daughter, a tale of India to some degree, and we've also got the Highlands Widow, a story again largely set in the Highlands. These are all fragments of stories that pitch up in Edinburgh that are brought together by Croft-Angry. And we can read Scott to some extent in that context, sitting in Edinburgh, bringing together stories, sometimes of Edinburgh, sometimes more widely from Scotland and beyond. Edinburgh is a place that enables him to tell stories, which often end up, which remain a bit fragmented. We'll come back and say a bit more about that. Prime Minister Jane Brodie, I'm not going to say much more about that just now. Obviously, it's Muriel Spark's Edinburgh book, but the Edinburgh in that book ends up coming to pieces in one's hands in all kinds of ways if one is an attentive reader. In terms of the borders, in some ways Walter Scott invents the Scottish borders, a bit of a truism, there's some truth in it, as he invents so much. A really dynamic book when it appears 1802, 1803, bringing together border ballads, but not only border ballads, it's a bit of a promiscuous book. It brings in also northeast ballads, ballads from elsewhere, but there is Scott putting the idea of the border ballad out there, and it takes on from that point. And I'll say a wee bit more about the contents shortly. Muriel Spark's connection with the border is altogether more contentious, but it comes from Walter Scott, and I'm going to show a couple of ways in which it does that, because she riffs on the idea of the ballads. And obviously enough, in a novel like The Ballads of Peckham Rye, 1960, we have a demonic character, a diabolic character, as though from Minstrelsy of the Scottish Border, who is set loose in London, and who does all kinds of things to traumatise the modern materialist society. Again, I'll give you a couple of examples of that as we go on. The idea of the borders in Walter Scott, the border, it fascinates Scott, and this should be no surprise. When he writes the border antiquities of England and Scotland in the 1810s, 1814 to 1817, he talks about the frontier region of most great kingdoms being a very interesting place. That's obviously where there are tensions, that's where you can tell about the formation of kingdoms, that's where you see cultures and states and nations coming together. He's fascinated by those places where the country ends, where it gets problematic. And he also, in the introduction to the Minstrelsy of the Scottish Border, he talks about the most memorable conflicts of two gallant nations, obviously, Scotland and England. Two nations but Scott, the Unionist, wants it to become, as indeed it had become, one kingdom. The idea of kingdom, the idea of nation, and we'll come back to that to some degree. Now, very fashionable word in literary criticism, a bit of a cliche, a bit sort of overused perhaps, the idea of in-betweenness, of liminality. And I think that it's strange the way in which Walter Scott sometimes has been portrayed as writing rather one-dimensional or two-dimensional romances, writing rather static historical fiction, when the dynamism in Walter Scott is often about the in-between places. And sometimes he's also overread as a kind of Enlightenment writer, and he is an Enlightenment writer, and he is interested in stadialism, the way in which society and culture progresses. But Scott, the romantic, as well as the man of the Enlightenment, is interested in places where so-called progress, where so-called joined-upness falls down, where we have liminality, where things fall to bits. Now, there's a strange irony in Scottish literary history. I'm going to attack the 20th century, as I often do, because I think that Scottish literary culture is often pretty stupid in the 20th century. And none more stupid than in Edwin Muir's book, Scotland, 1936, which, of course, coins the idea of Scotland, which says that what Walter Scott writes about is a history that's effectively gone, whether that's the Jacobites, whether it's the Covenanters, all that stuff is gone, and what's left in Scott's hands are just the remnants that he fetishises, that he writes about long after these things have got any relevance. In all kinds of ways, that misses the point. Because Scott is very interested in the way in which progress is rather painful. And we see this in very obvious places. We see it in Waverley, the tensions between Jacobites and Hanoverians. We see it in the tale of Old Mortality, where the Covenanting grave marker goes around repairing the graves, trying to keep the memories alive. It still means something to him and to his community. It still matters. And what Scott does time and again is he writes about societies where supposedly defeated and outmoded causes still have a resonance, still have a relevance. And he suggests to us that we might not so readily dismiss things that seem to be historically washed up as we often do. One of the ironies about Edwin Muir is that he is always dissing Walter Scott, but he imbibes from Scott the idea of the border ballads. Because the ballads, to some degree, in the classic period, are much more to do with the northeast. Certainly if you look through the 18th century, we get many ballads from the northeast, a strong tradition. Walter Scott includes some of these, as I mentioned, in the Minstrelsy of the Scottish Border. But it's Scott publishing this volume, indeed in Kelso, and including, yes, many border ballads, who stamps the notion across the Western world of the border ballads. A bit later on, a less exciting set of volumes, but in some ways more scholarly. We've got Francis Child's ballads, English and Scottish ballads, and what these show is that the ballad is much less to be rooted in place. They're not only across Scotland, but across the border into England. Walter Scott, his literary conceit is the border ballads. I think part of the reason that he's interested in the idea of the border ballad is because the border is an idea that he has in his head that fascinates him. I don't want to go into kind of bargain basement psychology, but time and again he's interested in a kind of borderland. And he's also interested in the idea of minstrelsy, the idea of singing the ballads. The curious thing about Walter Scott and the ballad is I think that Walter Scott brings about a situation where, for the first time, the ballad is something that's read rather than sung. And then there's an effect in the way in which Robert Burns is perceived, so that a whole bunch of Burns's songs are read almost as poems. That is first established, that idea of ballads, of songs being read rather than sung, by the minstrelsy of the Scottish border. And we find that throughout the Romantic period, I mean, you always had ballads, but the Romantic ballad becomes a kind of poetic form. There's one of a number of transformations that we get from Walter Scott. So the ballad, the idea of the ballad that later on Muriel Spark imbibes as well. And I'll say a bit more about Spark and ballads especially. Minstrels, fragments and songs, and the idea of the minstrel as singing the song becomes with Walter Scott transformed more into a narrator rather than a songster. He is the minstrel, he is the editor, he's the presenter of the border ballads, to some extent singing the songs of the borders, to some extent singing the songs of the nation. And I think there's a curious thing about Walter Scott where many of the ballads, as some of you will know, in Minstrel's Day of the Scottish Border, are ballads about conflict between Scotland and England. They're heroic ballads, they're ballads of war, but war by definition is a divisive thing. People talk about Walter Scott as though he's trying to bring together an organic together idea of Scotland, and sometimes he does, but what constantly frays with Walter Scott, even as he presents the borders of Scotland, are the ragged edges, are the ways in which, in all kinds of ways, history overwrites history. And I've been fascinated recently by St Ronan's Well, which I think demonstrates some of the kind of nice tensions, the creative tensions that are there in Walter Scott's work. St Ronan's Well in many ways replays a basic ballad scenario. We've got feuding families, but in the later 18th century, and in the spa town or the spa area of St Ronan's Well. But that spa area relates to the supposed monk, St Ronan, who establishes a holy well. So we've got the holy well, then we've got the spa over that, we've got the warring border family, and then we've got the more modern 18th century warring family. And the point that Scott is kind of making is that nothing ever really changes, and you see all these different layers. That's one way in which Walter Scott is genuinely conservative, in that he sees things as never really changing all that much. Human nature is essentially unchanging, and we see this in the border scenario of St Ronan's Well, which is also in some ways quite a modern novel. Not one of his more renowned novels perhaps, but interesting for all of those different layers. So what we've got with Walter Scott going into the 19th century and the creation of the ballad and the Lay of the Last Minstrel and the notion of minstrelsy itself is the idea of singing songs, and in some ways you sing the songs even if they're quite sad songs, because that's the only way in which you can capture some sense of things. Walter Scott isn't about a set version of Scotland. Scott is very aware that Scotland is constantly moving, constantly changing. Now let's think a wee bit about what we maybe call in the business an intertext, a particular connection between Muriel Spark and Minstrelsy of the Scottish Border. And like everyone else, I can only now imagine the Prime Miss Jane Brodie through the 1969 film. And there is that scenario where the singing master, Gordon Lowther, is pursuing Jane Brodie. And it's quite interesting to look at the way in which this is formed poetically, because he sings to her. He has a dirty weekend with her, sometimes with the girls visiting beforehand, and he woos her even as she surrounds herself with her girls. And what do we get? We get, first of all, the song that is there in the Minstrelsy of the Scottish Border, March, March, Ettrick and Teviotdale, why the Dale dinna ye march forward in order. March, March, Eskdale and Liddesdale, all the blue bonnets are over are bound for the border. And that might or might not be the Jacobites. It probably is. Charles Edward Stuart's a Jacobite ballad to some extent. And this is Gordon Lowther showing that he's a man. Let me sing you a war ballad, he says. This is him, his blood is up, he's showing his masculinity. Which is followed by a reference to Barbara Allen. If you want the best version of this ever, listen to the Everly Brothers. I wasn't going to mention them tonight, never mind. And what we've got there is a sad ballad where the lover marries the woman that he loves because he knows he's never going to properly have her. And we see in the reference to Barbara Allen, following on from March, March, the way in which Lowther's mood changes from blood up, I'm going to conquer this woman, to hopelessness. And the Prime Minister Jean Brodie is full of these kind of literary references that kind of form the material of the novel, whether it's references to Burns, which are in there, or James Hogg's Kilmeny, or Keats, or Tennyson. The whole world is formed by romantic poetry, all of which in some way, including all of those writers that are mentioned, with the exception of Burns, to a large degree their sensibility is formed by the doomed love romanticism that you find in minstrelsy of the Scottish border. Let's think a wee bit about Muriel Spark and the ballads, because it's an idea that she uses. Now, I've mentioned already the Ballad of Peckham Rye. Ballads become a kind of device in Spark's fiction. And basically the idea is that the folk rules must be observed. The folk rules can be summed up if we look at one of the texts in Minstrelsy of the Scottish border, and for that text we can turn to the Demon Lover. The Demon Lover is about a woman who's tempted by a very sexy man, but she doesn't read the warning signs. I mean, he basically shows her his cloven hoof, and she still says, yeah, I fancy you. He says, do you want to go away in a boat together, leave your husband and kids? And she says, yes, I'll do that. So they go off, and of course she ends up in hell. Like a lot of the ballads, it's very moralistic in quite a conservative way, but notice the folk rules that you get also in James Hogg's Confessions of a Justified Sinner. And this is not coincidental, because Hogg later on is working with Hogg on later versions of minstrelsy, and they're chatting about the folk rules, they're chatting about ballads. Basically, the devil can't just come in and take you because God's the governor. You have to give in to temptation. You have to willfully say, yes, I'm going off with the sexy man with the cloven hoof because that's what I choose to do. That's what the Demon Lover is about. And you see this in Muriel Spark's fiction time and again. You see it in the Ballad of Peckham Rye in all kinds of bizarre ways. So Dougal Douglas, the man who may have cysts on his head, and if we get time I'll maybe tell you about the time I really annoyed Muriel Spark by making reference to that, but we'll see if we get there. Dougal Douglas is the man who decides, I'm going to visit poetic justice on very materialistic Peckham. It's so obsessed with its washing machines, its white goods, its humanity obsessed with itself rather than the higher things, rather than thinking about philosophy or religion. So I'm going to take vengeance on these people. I might be an agent of the devil, or I might be an agent of God, and it's not quite clear. The same as in the Demon Lover. Is it the devil, or is the devil acting for God? So what does Dougal Douglas do? He lodges with a lady, and the way in which he leads her into evil is by making his bed very well, drawing praise from her. And what he's doing there is he's encouraging her petty bourgeois ways, her absolutely stupid obsession with tidiness and cleanliness, so that she becomes consumed with good housekeeping and ignores her own brother, who she doesn't recognise as a tramp on the street because he's filthy and unclean. Very typically Spark. Let me give you another wee example of the way in which this works. People often misread the Prime and Miss Jean Brodie because they say, oh well, Jean Brodie was culpable at least for the girl who goes off to fight in the Spanish Civil War. She encourages her, yes she does, but you notice that the girl who goes off to fight in the Spanish Civil War has been expelled from several schools already. In other words, all that Jean Brodie does, the demon lover, she encourages pre-existing tendencies. So there is always a chain of moral action, of free will, and that's what happens there. She is not simply an automaton in Brodie's hands. None of the girls ultimately are. The tragedy of Jean Brodie ultimately is that she has no control. And still thinking about the ballads and going back to the Ballad of Peckham Rye, we have Dougal Douglas also encouraging an affair between the manager and his secretary of the company with which he works. And he enters into a ménage à trois with the two so as to heighten the evilness. In fact, he hopes to make it more sexy and he doesn't succeed, because still Mr. Bruce, before making love to Muriel Coverdale in that book, insists in folding his trousers neatly over the chair before getting into bed with her, rather than being carried away on a tide of passion. And that's typical Spark. You don't have enough passion for either good or evil. You can't even do adultery right. And so Dougal continuously inserts insinuations so that in the end, quite tragically, why did I laugh there? Muriel Coverdale is murdered by Mr. Druce using a corkscrew with which he stabs her in the neck. And there's a parody of ballad violence. And what Spark is sort of saying, can we get back to this stuff? Can we be sexy? Can we be violent? She doesn't really mean that literally, but she's saying that our human sensibilities have become very, very blunted. And the other thing to say here is that Muriel Spark, like Scott, ultimately is not a Scottish exceptionalist. In a novel like Symposium, what we've got is the idea, which is expressed, that the Scots have a particular capacity for evil. But Spark doesn't actually believe that. She has her character say it, but actually you look at the people she writes about, including latterly modelling characters on the real life Lord Lucan, guess what? The Scots don't have a monopoly on evil. But to a large extent, the literary representation of evil, of the supernatural, to some degree is minted in Scotland from at least minstrelsy of the Scottish border onwards. And she plays around with all kinds of strange substitute supernatural effects. My favourite one is the way in which her dead lover, Hugh Carruthers, thank you Muriel Spark, you know that Carruthers is a Scottish and not an English name. I'm eternally grateful for that. Hugh Carruthers is a mixture of our two real-life lovers in the school, but he's also perhaps Robert Burns, he's perhaps a painter. He's an amalgam of different body parts. In other words, he is a Frankenstein's monster, and not for nothing is Muriel Spark a devotee of Mary Shelley. So we get this cod, supernatural, Gothic device, which is obviously not just a Scottish one. There'll be someone along in 5 minutes claiming that because Mary Shelley slept 2 nights in Dundee, that Frankenstein is a Scottish book, but let them each to their own. But the idea of evil is something that is very much, and human peccadillos in general, it's the human race. Who would have thunk it? And the same with Walter Scott, writing about the various Scottish and then European and other scenarios. Nothing particularly adds up all that well. Human nature is often something that falls to bits. I mean, we might think of Walter Scott's depiction of Edinburgh, obviously enough, in what I think is his greatest novel, The Heart of Midlothian, where we have supposed, or the supposition of infanticide, where we've got the Porteous riots, where the mob takes justice into its own hands. All these things are ragged bits that are misread, that don't add up. The Heart of Midlothian is full of dark and sinister things. It's not a safe place. It's a place where human nature ultimately is revealed in its bad bits, and ultimately, I suppose, in some ways, in its good bits. Not for nothing, Walter Scott's writer par excellence that he looks to time and again is Shakespeare, because it's all there in Shakespeare, all the human foibles. So with both Spark and Scott, we've got situations where places and situations seem to speak of a certain settled community, whether it's London or Edinburgh, but what disrupts these places is human behaviour, the way in which we do bad things. Spark's idea of the ballad is very much schooled in minstrelsy of the Scottish border, especially the idea of sudden deaths. And those of you in the Spark Society will be very familiar with, for instance, in Not to Disturb, one of the most notorious deaths in her fiction, where characters are killed in a very, very subordinate clause. Meanwhile, the lightning which strikes the elms so that two friends huddled there are killed instantly without pain, zigzags across the lawns, illuminating the lily ponds and the sunken rose garden. It's a very ridiculous sentence about death, and that's some of the kind of ridicule or ridiculous situation that you find in the ballads. The ballads have got a strong sense of the ludicrous, a strong sense of things not holding together all that well. You might also think of the death of Mary McGregor and the Prime Minister Jean Brodie, dies hideously in a hotel fire, running around as though a mouse caught in a maze, and that very cold, authorial, narratorial eye that looks at Mary McGregor's death, which is cruel, but which is also a kind of ballad death. What Spark takes and riffs on religiously, particularly according to her Roman Catholic predilections, is the thing that she takes from the ballads where violence is gratuitous, it's often enjoyed, it's often narrated quite callously. That's the thing that she gets from minstrelsy of the Scottish border and the idea of the ballad in general. That's also why we have to take a couple of obvious examples. The Portobello Road, where Needle is found dead in a haystack, and again the ballad's being transported to London. Or the Black Madonna, where a very nice, socially aware couple, good Catholics, good members of the Labour Party, very charitable folk, pray for a child. They're both white. They pray to the Black Madonna and have a black baby. That's where God is the cosmic joker in Muriel Spark. But it turns out that the baby is what we used to call on fashion, in less than PC terms, a throwback. The baby is their baby, but they can't stand the social stigma, and so they give the baby up for adoption. And the whole point about that story there, looking at it through Spark's eyes, is that they've failed the test of love because they've done the wrong thing. They couldn't put up with people muttering, not least because they had two black lodgers 10 months before. They couldn't put up with people muttering about the baby. So they put it up for adoption, which the priest says is the right thing for them to have done, but not a good thing. So even these good people suffer, and the point is that, you know, according to Spark, these Christians, if you're a Christian, you're not here to have the kind of life where everything is plain sailing. It's how you put up with the bad stuff. These ballad moments that we get in Spark. Walter Scott much more has to do with, if you like, a more authentic folk culture. It's quite remarkable when we have the supposedly patrician Walter Scott minting the idea of the demotic, folksy ballads more than anyone. People didn't know they had ballads till Walter Scott told them. Yes, they sung them, but he's the guy who defines the genre. And very similarly with things like the chapbook. Now, really tedious chapbook scholars will argue for hours and hours over the definition of a chapbook, and Walter Scott's got one of the best collections of chapbooks. And Walter Scott's use of chapbooks in the Waverley novels and the poetry and elsewhere, and at the moment Ali Lumsden, Ainsley McIntosh and myself are putting together a volume of essays on Scott's chapbooks. Like the ballads with the chapbooks, Walter Scott is the man who in a sense to some extent, at the risk of exaggerating, defines the genre, says that pamphlets and chapbooks, these are things that are of interest, often things involving true crime as well, gallows ballads and the like. These things are there to tell us things about human nature just as much as novels. And we shouldn't forget that novels, which tend to be seen sometimes as being a highfalutin or a kind of upwardly mobile genre, the novel was very much a bourgeois phenomenon. Was seen as a bit vulgar in certain higher circles. So Walter Scott, when he's writing novels, when he invents the historical novel, and also when he pioneers folk culture, because that's what he does, this is Walter Scott getting down with the kids or getting down with the people. So we should be very aware of the misattribution of his reputation later on as someone who's practicing high literary genres all the time. Time and again, we've got violence, we've got uncertainty, both in the Borders and in Edinburgh with Walter Scott. And of course Stevenson, who's a huge influence also on Muriel Spark, and who also runs through the Prime Minister Jean Brodie. There's a kind of lineage there where they're interested in legal lore, in folklore, and that runs right through those three writers. I want to think a wee bit about the way in which Muriel Spark's romantic practice, and it's such a shame that Walter Scott, the greatest romantic writer of his day, the greatest writer that Scotland has ever produced, is sort of decanonised not only as a Scottish writer to some extent in some circles, he's also in recent decades been somewhat decanonised as a romantic writer, which flies in the face of his sales and his reputation at the time and for a long time after his life. The way in which the romantic idea of literature is often coined by Walter Scott. I want to think about a passage in the Prime of Miss Jean Brodie that tells us quite a bit about what happens. I'm obsessed with the beginning of chapter 3 and the way in which the voice is both romantic and unromantic, and it starts poetically. The days passed and the wind blew from the forth. It's poetry. It's not to be supposed that Miss Brodie was unique at this point in her prime, or that, since such things are relative, she was in any way off her head. And there's that throwaway colloquialism. She was alone merely in that she taught in a school like Marcia Blaine's. There were legions of her kind during the 1930s, women from the age of 30 and upward, who crowded their war-bereaved spinsterhood with voyages of discovery into new ideas and energetic practices in art or social welfare, education or religion. The progressive spinsters of Edinburgh, who are now running Creative Scotland, no, they're not all, did not teach in schools, especially in schools of traditional character like Marcia Blaine's Schools for Girls. Very interesting words in there, the word legion. It's a clue to the biblical subtext. In the Synoptic Gospels, there is the parable of the story of the gathering swine, where Christ drives the demon out into the herd of swine. The swine go over the cliff, and before that, Christ interrogates the demon and says, "Who are you?" And the demon says, "My name is Legion, for we are many." Legion, that word crops up time and again. This is the melodramatic idea that Jean Brodie is possessed, that she's demotic. She is in some ways, but in other ways she's not. She is self-dramatising. She makes herself into a Mary Queen of Scots figure. And again, it's Muriel Spark's reading of Walter Scott above all else, and his portraits of Mary Queen of Scots that somewhat inform the prime of just Miss Jean Brodie, where Brodie in some of her moods seems like Mary Queen of Scots, even though she's also a bit like John Knox. This uncertainty again in Edinburgh, this uncertainty at the heart of culture. And this passage at the beginning of chapter 3 basically says, Jean Brodie's quite a sad character. She's there in a position teaching in schools because a lot of the blokes have been killed during World War I. So she's in this position, And to keep this position, if we read it almost in feminist terms, she must resist being tied down by a male lover. And that's a typical story down to the 1960s. To get on and have a career in teaching, very often, if you were a woman, you would remain single. And that's what is going on here with Jean Brodie. And Jean Brodie also is into lots of different ideas, but she's less radical than these other women. The kind of women who say in the grocer, I tell you this, Mr. Geddes, birth control is the only answer, the problem of the working class, a free issue to every household. And in that same passage too, we have mention of Mary Stopes, who Muriel Spark detested with a passion. She suspected Stopes of anti-Semitism, for one, and secondly, Spark blamed Stopes for having her ultimately removed from the Poetry Society as secretary. And so the idea here of contraception, Stopes being an advocate of that, and that being a progressive idea, we read that, but we're supposed to think, hang on a minute, what's going on in this novel? Jean Brodie is trying to mould the lives, control the lives of our girls. You shouldn't be doing that. And also the idea of eugenics and even the idea of contraception. Be careful about playing God, says Muriel Spark, who frankly is a pre-Vatican II Roman Catholic, and that informs her mentality. That passage is in turn poetic, got social history, it's got daft throwaway vulgarisms like off her head or in no way off her head. It's got a biblical subtext to the Gospels in Legion. It's a whole riot of things. It's a passage that comes to bits. It's a passage that is a bit unstable. And that's the thing about the instability of Muriel Spark's writing. A brilliant stylist, as indeed I would argue is Walter Scott, but what they write about thematically is the unstable stuff. That's what we get time and again. That's the very curious thing about their reputations as being somewhat stage writers, according to some. So I've mentioned The Heart of Midlothian already, I've mentioned the Chronicles of the Canongate a wee bit, but again, it's interesting, although there's a lot of writing about Edinburgh and Scott's work and in his career. Last week I came through the very strange experience of going to Edinburgh Castle for the 40th anniversary of the Scottish Poetry Library. And beforehand, before mixing with all these trendy poets, some of whom are friends, I'll admit to that. Before that, we were offered a look at the Scottish Crown Jewels, or rather the Honours of Scotland, which of course were discovered by Walter Scott. And we can think of those, we can think of the notorious episode of Scott bringing George IV to Edinburgh in 1822. We can think of often Scott's fetishisation of the royal family and dedicating work to them. In some senses, Scott perhaps believed in not very much other than the idea of a royal family bringing things together, because everything else he wrote about was a bit uncertain, was not to be relied upon. I think the Chronicles of the Canongate, with its medieval subtext, with, as I've mentioned already, its narrator, who is a debtor, just at the point when Scott himself has fallen into bankruptcy. What we've got is a quality of Edinburgh life that is very uncertain, which is often quite brutal, which is cruel, and yet one of the many reasons I love Walter Scott is the heroism with which in those years in the latter 1820s he ruins his health by repaying debts which he wasn't really responsible for creating, through going into overdrive with his writing, including Chronicles of the Canongate. Time and again, the good news, because we don't want Scott or Spark to basically just be purveyors of a tourist Edinburgh or a tourist Borders, we get problematic places. We get a quality of life that is uncertain, that is violent, etc., which in its own way, as I keep alluding to, is somewhat attractive and romantic. Both of these writers are quite scary writers. They're quite uncomfortable writers, and I think that's a good thing. I'm often bemused by the way in which there's a writer of tartan noir on every street corner in both Edinburgh and Glasgow. And I love a lot of that stuff myself, and saluting you there, Olga. I love that kind of crime fiction, but it's curious the way in which often that is a kind of comfortable read. Neither Muriel Spark nor Walter Scott are comfortable to read. There's all kinds of places in their writing where you think, you know, whether it's The Driver's Seat that some of us were discussing earlier on, it's a genuinely scary book, but also books like The Tale of Old Mortality, which is also quite scary, where we see human nature being fanatical, again being violent, etc., etc. And yet it's curious the way in which Scott and Spark are seen as the property of the bourgeois class, especially of Edinburgh. Very odd thing, because they're much more than that. Even though Walter Scott, as I've said, certainly has a predilection for royalty, which I, as a thorough-going Republican, find a wee bit uncomfortable, but I don't care, because I don't need my writers to echo my beliefs back to me. That's the scary thing I find as I get older about some students who want books that echo back what they already believe. Well, what's the point of us turning up? We've got Muriel Spark, who often has these wonderfully eccentric moments, or are they so eccentric? My favourite moment is when she says that Hugh McDermott should be tried for sedition and probably sent to jail. And this is in the light of about 10 years ago, long after McDermott's death, when some of his Blitz poems appear and McDermott says, oh, the Nazis are bombing London. I don't care. What does that matter in relation to a free and independent Scotland? And Muriel, reading this decades later, quite rightly I think, goes ballistic and says, put that man in the jail. You know, so seriously, you think that Scottish independence is more crucial than fighting the Nazis. Two writers writing from the heart of the establishment in some ways, a Crown lawyer in all kinds of ways, Muriel Spark working for the Foreign Office, for British intelligence, and we never entirely got to the bottom of her career during World War II. These two very establishment writers, but who would have thunk it, making us often uncomfortable, writing about life and reality that doesn't add up easily. There's Mary Stopes, who, as I've said, features in The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie without any comment, but if we're alert readers, we realise that Spark doesn't like her as another interferer, especially in working class lives, a free issue to the working class. Every household of the working class, that's the only answer. Muriel Spark's morality doesn't like that dictation of how other people live according to certain so-called authorities. So I think I'm drawing towards an end here. The other thing I would throw in, which again is a bit ballad-like, is Sandy Stranger, who has a ballad-like name, a name that features in the ballads, which is reiterated in Confessions of a Justified Sinner, at least when we get, I'm aware that Peter's sitting there, when we get the mention of there were strangers. That's a kind of signal that there might maybe be something demonic going on. Sandy Stranger would go and stand outside St Giles Cathedral to make her realise that in Edinburgh there was a special quality of evil to be found there and nowhere else. Complete nonsense. Spark doesn't believe that. But what happens is that a certain character, Sandy Stranger, melodramatically believes that. And again, this gets a bit circular. This is because the ballads, the special nature of Scotland supposedly, has told them that we've got the ballads, we've got the supernatural, we've got all these things that are going on that are especially scary. And we sort of do have these things, but not exclusively, nor especially so. Other countries have these things as well, and very often Walter Scott, who brings this stuff in, has been reading the horror that he finds in German literature, and that German literature reviving from the 1790s is a reaction in some ways to the French Revolution, and the terror. It's a kind of displacement, or rather a kind of response to that says, right, let's absorb ourselves in supernatural tales, let's look at horrific tales because we're all a bit scared, so let's immerse ourselves in the experience. Scott takes that German thing, pours it into his poetry, into minstrelsy of the Scottish border, as well as genuinely being an antiquarian and collecting material, and then writing about this. And guess what? Just as I come to an end, Muriel Spark and Walter Scott are read way beyond Scotland. They have a huge impact on Western culture generally, both of them. Muriel Spark is the most successful Scottish writer, critically in terms of popular appeal, since Robert Louis Stevenson, although probably the sales of J.K. Rowling and A.J. Cronin and one other that I've now forgotten probably are in excess of hers, but these are writers with a particular international appeal, and that also in some ways means that they're not respected as much in Scotland, and also their Scottishness. The way in which they treat Scottish life is often not as appreciated either. Very curious the way in which both of them, politically unionists, culturally very wide-ranging, both writing about things beyond Scotland. They're not a comfortable fit for the standard post-1930 version of Scottish literature. Robin Jenkins saying that Muriel Spark isn't a Scottish writer, and no one that I know thinks she is, because too often she writes about France or Italy or New York as much as she writes about Scotland. Says Robin Jenkins, a fine writer who writes about Afghanistan, who writes about Spain. Very odd, this purblindness that we have to Spark and Scott, two of the greatest Scottish writers ever. Scott the greatest, Spark in the top 5. No, we're not going to play that game. But curiously, I mean, I realise as a teacher of Scottish literature that anything I say makes no difference, because too many of my students, this is being recorded, isn't it? Too many of my students come in and they just want their version of the world, as I've sort of alluded to, attested to yet again. I would rather students come in and come out with a completely different version of things from what I'm saying or what anyone else does, but their sense of Scottishness is very narrow. And one of the enduring reasons to read both Walter Scott and Muriel Spark is that they tell us a lot about Scotland, but what they tell us about is the uncertain Scotland, not the certain Scotland. The difficulties of being Scottish, of being human. Had I actually had 4 hours, and I realised to properly parse this stupid topic that I stupidly suggested to David about a year ago, we might have been able to do this at some length. But I think I'll end it there, and there may even be time, a wee bit of time to lightly grim it. Thank you.
First of all, while you have just a sip of water there, Gerry, as well, thank you ever so much for taking us on that deep dive into the ballad-like world of Scott and Spark. And I know for me, certainly, it makes me want to plunge into that uncertainty and revisit some of those novels in the light of that. So thank you ever so much. And I'm sure it's also opened up questions. So we've got a little bit of time for a few questions.
Thank you so much. That was magnificent. Really enjoyed that very much indeed. I wanted to ask, please will you tell us about your conversation with Muriel Spark about Dougal Douglas's protuberances?
Okay, now that she's safely dead, Dame Muriel. So this started off quite innocently. I was reading the Ballad of Peckham Rye. In fact, I wasn't. I was reading the diaries of James Boswell. And Boswell at one point talks about developing cysts on his head. And then I was reading on, and it said when he was a boy, he had a real talent as a ventriloquist. And there were 2 or 3 other things, and I thought, wait a minute, Dougal Douglas is James Boswell. So I said to Robin at the National Library of Scotland, I said, I think that Dougal Douglas is a version of James Boswell. And Robin said, I've been helping Dame Muriel collect Boswell manuscripts. I said, gotcha. She said, I'll tell her that. And so she told Dame Muriel, and the message came, tell Carruthers he's talking absolute rubbish, nothing to do with James Boswell, absolutely wide of that. I thought, it's true. And I'm sure, to be fair to Muriel Spark, even if it was conscious, it's probably just part of the creative genes of Dougal Douglas. But I'm quite convinced that that's part of the DNA. I keep threatening to do this as a paper for the 18th Century Scottish Studies Society, as a kind of party piece, and I might do it because there's a wee bit more to it than that. But I was saying to Robin at one point, of course, is now retired, could you write me a letter? Like, you said, no, I wouldn't dare, so fair enough. So my evidence base is a wee bit thin there, but certainly the resemblance is quite remarkable.
Professor Carruthers from the back row. I'm quite interested in some of these Bolshe students of yours that want to go gang their own gate. My point of interest is, speaking as some of us that are pensioners now, I'm quite interested in the formative years in the Scottish school system, and in England and Cumbria as well, I should say. What are the what exposure do our kids get to our primal balladry, say between 5 and 11. I speak from this particular example. Old headmaster had been an old soldier, was teaching in Annandale, and I can get it his working notebooks because he would have been born about 1900, and we had Kilmeny, Hawk. I'm telling you, and I've got this in pencil handwriting. My sister managed to preserve it. And there's Byron, there's Burns in Fairbank, John Masefield. So, can you tell us at the moment the cohort of boys and girls that you're coming to your classes now, say between 18, 19, 20, what interesting, I wouldn't call it baggage, but what quality of that may they possibly have been exposed to? Shall we say that I'm really talking about Scottish syllabus and Scotland between say year 2000 and say 2010. What is the Scottish syllabus for these kids this moment in time before they come to you with their minds made up? 10, 15 years later, exposed to all stupid American media.
I wouldn't claim to know a lot about this, but I know various primary teachers, and looking at the evidence of my students, they come in and some will know the floors of the forest. Why? Because they've been reading Sunset Song, and sadly they've all been put off Sunset Song, which is a great book because they're all force-fed it at school. And in primary school, at certain points of the year, some of them will get ballads, or I do worry a wee bit. I mean, I never really believe that things are getting worse. Genuinely, things are never getting worse, they're never getting better. That's my conclusion about the world. But what we do get is a kind of surrendering to, in education and elsewhere, well, you can't give the kids too much. So I've known of one instance where a teacher gave them half a ballad, which I don't quite understand. Let's give them bites of things that fit into a project or a theme. Let's spoon feed them. And you're right, down to probably the 60s, and I'm thinking of the novels of David Lodge here, where in National Service a not very bright guy comes in and he can recite screeds of Walter Scott's poetry, which tells you something about the education system. Well, that's a work of fiction, and I think it reflects on something real. I think also to some extent the Primalist Jean Brodie with Kilmeny, with Wordsworth, reflects some of the education in poetry and balladry that she herself would have experienced. But most of that, I think, has gone. Actually, I'm a wee bit heretical. I don't believe in teaching the ballads in literary courses, which is to say, I would teach them honours level as something special, minstrelsy of the Scottish border perhaps, but I don't believe that the ballads is literature. I think it's something else, they're songs. So there is a kind of problem. That's, well, actually, let's be honest, a specific Scottish problem, and it goes back to that bastard Edwin Muir again, because he basically says that during the Reformation and afterwards, when the English were doing this wonderful drama, Shakespeare and Marlowe and all that stuff, the Scots literary impetus went underground into the ballads, and that wasn't, as though the ballads are a kind of debased literary impulse when you don't have the drama, because England has this natural organic development and Scotland doesn't. It's all over the place, and then that feeds into a rather dodgy version of Scottish cultural nationalism that says we do the ballads because we're down to earth, we're demotic, blah 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 blah. It's yet another item in the kind of bonnet hustling credentials of modern Scottish literature. So much as I love the ballads, they are misused yet again. Say, bloody English, Poncy English, they do literature and drama. we do the ballads, and the ballads is basically people in a square go. That kind of stuff really grates. So it's all about context, it's all about how you use these things, and I've no doubt that much of the traditional rote learning school pre-1960s was in many ways harmful in itself, but nonetheless, perhaps, like the timetables, you retain a sense of these which might be activated later. So in terms of what students come in with now, and we've been asked recently, should we refresh the Burns poems we've been doing for the past 15 years, to which the answer is yes, you bloody well should refresh them. There is a problem in spoon feeding, and we need to find more creative ways of teaching literature, I think, at schools, maybe at universities too. I'm not going to try and stand apart from this. Where I've got the slight note of depression, as indicated already, is that too many of my students come in as Scottish nationalists, and I don't have a problem with that, but they're looking for stuff just to affirm what they already believe, and I kind of think, what's the point of that? And also, where I get a wee bit sensitive about this is many of them are prejudiced against both Scott and Spark, because Scott is a unionist. Oh well, you can't read him then, and Spark is a writer who's too cosmopolitan. You know, and it's a bit like, I'm going to have another go at Shug here, Alex. It's a bit like when McDermott says to Trocky, "You're cosmopolitan scum." That's the Soviet anti-Semitic insult of the day, and Spark was also aware of that. She's aware of undertones of anti-Semitism, and I think of that god-awful painting, I've really started now, Poets Pub, which got all the blokes in it. Even in the 1980s, that is old-fashioned, and the woman and the gay guy Eddie Morgan are marginalised. That very masculine, male, Scottish nationalist culture. So Spark and Scott don't fit, and it's an uphill struggle trying to teach both writers, except perhaps the Prime Minister Ian Brodie, because it's just so racy to read, and maybe the driver's seat if they get to that. But other than that, they just think both these writers are too middle class, and in fact, in many ways, we need more middle class writers. Am I a Burns scholar? Am I saying that? Yes, I am. We need more middle class writers in Scotland getting their due, rather than a kind of faux version of working classness, which sometimes extends to the idea of the ballads.
I'm sure that there are more questions on that topic perhaps and others, but perhaps if you're able to stay afterwards, Gerry, there might be an opportunity to pick those up during the drinks reception. So at this point, I'd like to invite Eric Dixon of the Neurospark Society to give the vote of thanks.
Hello everybody, my name is Eric Dixon. I'm the chairman of the Muriel Spark Society, and I just wanted to mention a few dates at the very beginning. Our society doesn't go back over 130 years like yours. We were formed by our founding chairman, Christine Lloyd, in 2001, so we're a lot younger. But I was in touch with Christine today, and she did say to me that 20 years ago she met your then secretary to suggest a joint venture. Here we are today, and I thought I'd mention that, and I know that would mean something to Christine. So that's great. I'd also like to thank, before I talk about Gerry's wonderful talk, the anonymous donor, the person who might be in this room who supported our event this evening, particularly for our members. So thank you very much. We very much appreciate it, and you're all extremely generous. It's a wonderful setting, and it's taken us to a new place, and I love it very much. I really liked this lecture because it was just so full of heft, it was so full of detail. In 1932, Muriel Camberg won a poetry competition in Edinburgh to celebrate or mark the centenary of the death of Sir Walter Scott, and it's called Out of a Book. It sometimes doesn't get anthologised, but she sort of started with Scott in some ways. And you know, I always knew that her relationship with Scott was very complex, perhaps a bit contradictory, and I knew there would be a lot to talk about. And my goodness, we got that tonight from Gerry. It was so full of detail, so full of weight, and it was brilliant and really opened my eyes and made me look at Muriel's work again, made me look again at Scott and want to go back to Scott, because I've not read him for a while, so I'd like to go back and experience that again. So, and I think that's the best thing you can get from one of these things, isn't it? It makes you want to go back and reread, and makes you want to go back and explore. And that's what the lecture did for us tonight. So I thank you very much indeed. Indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. And just very finally, before we part ways or indeed join one another just outside, if I can also mention some future dates for the Edinburgh Sir Walter Scott Club, just in case you haven't already got those in your diaries, or indeed if you don't already have tickets. I believe there are some tickets for the next event on the table there. So the next event is on Saturday the 19th of October at 11 AM. That's the event, the excursion to the National Galleries of Scotland, funnily enough called Sir Walter Scott in the Galleries. It's a free trip, but there are tickets there, but I'm informed that we do need to have a record of everybody who's coming, so if you are going to take a ticket, please make a note of your name or let somebody know that you've taken that there. Then on the 31st of October, another joint lecture, this time with the University of Edinburgh Literature Department, and that is at the Advocates Library. Again, that's where we're going to be hearing from Paul Barnaby about the relationship between Walter Scott and James Skene, so I believe there are tickets also for that as well, and the same thing, we do need a note of everybody who's coming there too. And then on the 28th of November, much further ahead, we've got Helen Graham talking about Scott's favourite comedian. I don't believe that there are tickets here for that this evening, but again, you can get in touch in the usual ways to arrange for tickets as well. So that's just some future notes on Scott Club dates, but I'd like to invite everybody once again to join together to say thank you very much to Gerald. And hopefully to stay for some refreshments outside as well. Thank you very much.